Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello. My guest is Dean Norman. He is a retired cartoonist who has written for comic books. He's been a writer for TV animation. He has contributed to Mad Magazine, created cartoons for greeting cards, and he is the creator of Wally's Woods comic strip, as well as being author of On the Lewis and Clark Trail, Wally Woods Volume 2. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Yes, I'm glad to be here.
I thoroughly enjoyed reading and looking at the cute drawings in your strip about Lewis and Clark, because you took the historic facts, which you tried to be as true as possible, about this very famous expedition from St. Louis, the Missouri River, to Portland, Oregon on the Pacific Ocean, but you had the characters from that expedition back in the early 1800s with modern-day animals portraying them. Tell us first about the Lewis and Clark expedition. How significant was it? What was the territory that they covered, the rivers, the mountains?
The Lewis and Clark Trail was one of the wonderful adventures. If you could go back in time and be a member of an expedition, that'd be a good one, because almost everybody survived and came back in good health, except one sergeant who died of a burst appendix. They were diplomats instead of warriors. Like, they didn't conquer anybody and try to shoot people. They tried to establish peaceful relations with Indian nations that had never even met white men. You read the Lewis and Clark journals about what happened on the way, and they weren't comfortable. Sometimes they were having a lot of problems with the weather, and they almost starved to death, but they made it back. In a sense, it was really part of the invasion and conquest of the Indian nations. They didn't look at it that way at the time. They thought they could just trade with the Indians and both would prosper. It's a wonderful expedition. It's nice to read books about it, and there's an organization called We Proceeded On that continues to research and find new information about it. I thought it was so nice that I traveled parts of the Lewis and Clark Trail and then wrote this comic book story about it.
President Thomas Jefferson sent these gentlemen out to lead the expedition to find out more about territory that did not belong to the United States at the time. Was it under any European control, or did you just have many, many different Indian nations like the Madden and the Hidatsa and the Arikara and the Sioux living in the territory?
Oh, yes, they were independent nations. Lewis would meet them and said, your Spanish fathers and your French fathers have gone away, and now you're under the protection of the Great White Father in Washington, D.C., and they didn't know what he was talking about. They knew who their fathers were. They just didn't understand what he was saying, that the United States was claiming that they owned all of that land.
So the United States chose to add this territory by conquest?
Well, they bought it. They paid for it, but then nobody really owned it. I mean, Spain claimed they owned it because they had somebody go up the Mississippi River a little ways. Then France bought it from them, so they claimed they owned it, and it was the law of Europe. If they found some land that another European nation didn't think, they could just take it over. That was pretty bad, but that was the attitude in those days.
As part of this book on the Lewis and Clark Trail, you had many pages with your contributing author, Dakota Goodhouse, who described via a pictographic history that he drew, but he also wrote about the history of the Indians in the area and how they were conquered and put onto reservations, and how they were not allowed to live their traditional lifestyle, and how enemy tribes were put together on the reservations, eventually had to work together as a united tribe. And you go up into current history, where even into the 1970s, we didn't get the Indian Civil Rights Act, the Indian Education Act, the Indian Religious Freedom Act, Act, the Child Welfare Act, the Gaming Regulatory Act, the Arts and Craft Act, and in the 1990s, it took another act for the Graves and Repatriation Act. This is a long-standing history of how America, and as you said, the previous European colonizers, were truly destroying the Indian nations, and how it's just been very, very recent that we have recognized that they were nations, are independent peoples.
Yeah, that's quite a story. When I met Dakota Goodhouse, I was at Bismarck, North Dakota, and he was working for a state park there where he would sometimes be an actor and portray an Indian, and sometimes he would portray a soldier. I asked him to write something, and I really didn't know what he would do. But I learned a lot from what he wrote about the history of the Plains Indians, and particularly that group right there in North Dakota, where the Mandan and the Arikara and the Hidatsa Indians now have a reservation called United Tribes. So it was really nice, and recently I gave a copy of that book to the American Indian Museum in Washington, D.C., so it has Dakota Goodhouse's part of the comic book plus the part that I drew.
The expedition traveled up rivers before they could travel down rivers. That took a lot of work because they were going against the flow of the river. How many miles did they actually travel, and did they do it primarily via rivers?
I don't know what the miles are. It's an awfully long way. You can't really go up the Missouri River the same way now because at the time, it was a natural river that wound around, and it would have a current sometimes on one side and an upstream current and an eddy. And they would use oars or poles on the bottom, and they could push upstream the eddy, and then they'd go across, and then they would paddle. And now they have channeled the Missouri River from St. Louis clear up to Sioux City, Iowa, for barge traffic. And it's almost all a downstream current. You could not possibly get upstream unless you used a motor. It's not the same Missouri River that Lewis and Clark saw until you get into Montana. And there are some stretches of the river that are undeveloped. And that's where I went originally, because I heard that it looks like it did when Lewis and Clark were there. And I found out that's true. I read the Lewis and Clark journals and took copies with me. We canoed the river, and you could read his description, and you'd sit there and you'd see the same scenery, with the exception that you didn't see buffalo and elk and all the wildlife that used to be there.
Well, let's talk about the buffalo, because we know that there were millions of buffalo herds. The traditional Indians would kill and use all parts, everything from the hides to the meat. But yet Europeans came along, and when they established the trains through the area, people would just shoot the animals and not even use the animal.
Yeah, that's true. That's one of the awful tragedies of how they just slaughtered buffalo, sometimes for fun, sometimes to take the hides back and sell them. Part of it, the government decided that was a way to defeat the Indian warriors, is to kill all the buffalo, and they wouldn't have food, and they would have to surrender. It's difficult to hear about it or read about it.
You talk about Beaver Creek and the beavers, and there was a time when the beavers almost became extinct because they were being hunted for their fur to send back to Europe. Have they been saved?
Yeah, that's one of the good stories about conservation. The beavers almost became extinct because of trappers wanting to sell the fur, and they'd make them into a top hat. Aristocrats in Europe wanted to have a beaver hat, and the fashion changed. They didn't want that anymore, and the price of beaver fur just went way down. And at the time, there were so few beavers in North America. There was a biologist in North Dakota, and he found one colony in the whole state of North Dakota, and he wouldn't tell where it was. Some farmer was protecting it. But they've been protected, and then beavers have been taken to other places, and now it isn't very profitable to trap beavers. Not many people do it unless they just are interested in trapping. They're in almost every river and creek where they used to be, all over North America and into Mexico. My favorite canoe river in Ohio is Little Beaver Creek in southeast Ohio, and that's where I decided to base my comic strip, because I thought one time I might retire, buy a cabin down there. I called it Beaver Creek. And I found out there's a Beaver Creek or Beaver River in every state in the United States and in all provinces of Canada except Hawaii. The beavers have never gotten to Hawaii, fortunately. Things like Beaver Creek in the comic strip could be anywhere.
Well, certainly there are many different rivers and creeks and eddies that you talk about, and you also share the fact that if someone followed the current trail now, you'd be running into highways and the rivers would be dammed and not free-flowing. It's not the same. So how do you compare the current look of the trail versus when Lewis and Clark did it?
Well, I haven't traveled the whole trail. I went to the places that I found out hadn't been developed and changed much. And then I read a book by two guys that did travel the whole trail, and they took a motorboat from St. Louis up the Missouri River and went through all the reservoirs, and they did a lot of camping and hiking. I mean, they did it, in a primitive way and wrote a very interesting book. And it told me the places I really didn't want to see because it's not the Lewis and Clark Trail. It's not what Lewis and Clark saw. But there are places in Montana and Idaho that haven't been developed. It's interesting to see it, and it's really a nice place for vacation and adventure. The Missouri River in Montana near Fort Benton, and the upper rivers from the Three Forks, the Jefferson River, the Beaverhead River, the Lemhi Pass, where you can walk over, and you can just imagine you were Lewis walking up that. It's an easy walk up to the pass, and then you look and you see the Rocky Mountains to the west, and he saw those, and he was very discouraged. He knew he was in for trouble. And then when you go from Lemhi Pass into Idaho and Montana, it's very nice. It's down in Salmon, Idaho, and a place called Lost Trail Pass, where you go into Montana. And then there's a Lolo Trail where the Lochsa River flows, and they've got a primitive road up there. And people go up there, and they actually won't probably see it as Lewis and Clark saw it because they were there in the winter and they almost starved to death. I wouldn't recommend going there at that time. But in the summer, it's really a nice place to hike or camp on the Lolo Trail and views of the mountains. That's nice. The Clearwater River, there's a lot of good canoeing on the Clearwater. And then after that, the Snake River and the Columbia River has been impounded, and you're just going through one reservoir after another. There's no current, and the salmon are dying. It's not the Lewis and Clark Trail. What we have now, from a natural point of view, it's not very good, but they are trying to take some of the dams down the Snake River and get the salmon run to come back up the Columbia. And as far as very few salmon make it as far as Salmon, Idaho anymore. But so few that they hardly bother to fish for them.
And there are also a couple of reconstructed forts that they had built. But I'd like you to tell me about the different animals that you had represent the different members of the Lewis and Clark expedition. You wrote this comic strip using the historic expedition, but yet you used animals in the present day, from beavers to a goose.
I've always liked animal cartoons, like Bugs Bunny.
And you wrote some cartoon stories for some of the traditional characters.
Yeah, yes, that's it. For a while I was unemployed and I couldn't find any work except writing for comic books. I wrote for Bugs Bunny and Sylvester and Tweety, and I always admired the Pogo comic strip because she drew animals so funny and so neat. I had all this information about the Lewis and Clark, and I wanted to do a comic strip, and I wanted to be funny, but I didn't want to change history. And so I don't know how I got the idea of having Lewis and Clark and other expedition members born again as animals instead of humans, which I guess it's the Hindus believe that really happens. For me, it's just kind of a cartoon gimmick. I don't know why I picked particular animals. I started out with the beaver because I had already drawn the beaver cartoon many times. And I'm not sure why I took a Canada goose and decided that would be Meriwether Lewis. A 13-line ground squirrel was Sergeant Floyd. He's buried. The remains of Sergeant Floyd was buried in the prairie out near Sioux City, Iowa, where the 13-line ground squirrel lives on his graveside, actually. And so I had that one, and then when I got out west, I decided to make Toussaint Charbonneau, a grizzly bear, which is kind of, he was sort of a cowardly person in his real life, and a grizzly bear is not cowardly at all. People are afraid of a grizzly bear. And there was Janie Sacagawea, and she didn't figure prominently in my comic book story, but I had her as a small bird that lives near the Lemhi Pass, where the Shoshone lived. And then I had Indian chiefs reborn as various animals. Shikaka, who was a bison, he was a Mandan chief. Well, there were a couple other chiefs. In that way, it made the story funny, but at the same time, I didn't change what I had read in history, which either happened or might have happened.
And you had a pet dog that came back as a human.
Yeah, that was the thing I had the most fun on, because I think kids particularly liked the idea that there was a dog that went along with Lewis and Clark. And there was no reason for him to take a dog. He just wanted to have a dog. I mean, it wasn't essential to have a dog. And he bought this huge Labrador, which he named Seaman. And for many years, people read his journal and thought it was scamming. And someone finally figured out and looked at the original journal and said, no, that's not a C, that's an E. And the ink spread and made it look like a C. So now they say his name is Seaman, which makes sense because that's a Labrador Newfoundland dog. They were bred to rescue people at sea. So I don't know where I got the idea to have my character Wally become, he's a reincarnation of the dog Seaman, and he never knows it. But I needed a character who could paddle a canoe in order to do the canoe trip down the Missouri River and take Lewis and Clark, who were a goose and a beaver, on a canoe. And that worked out. That was the most fun part of the comic strip.
It was such a delight to read your book on the Lewis and Clark Trail, Wally's Woods, Volume 2, because it was covering some of the historic issues, but in a delightful cartoon fashion that we could all appreciate. Adult children, and the history of what went on with the Indian tribes of the area and how they were treated and what some of the battles were to preserve and protect their traditional lifestyle. We'll be back in a moment with more ecological issues.
Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman continues with further discussion of the world's critical ecological issues. For more information, you may call 310-559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, here's Nancy.
My guest is Dean Norman. He is a retired cartoonist who has written for comic books. He's been a writer for TV animation. He has contributed to Mad Magazine, created cartoons for greeting cards, and he is the creator of Wally's Woods comic strip, as well as being author of On the Lewis and Clark Trail, Wally Woods Volume 2. You love nature, you love wildlife, you've provided many cartoons about wildlife. Is your goal to get people to enjoy wildlife, both when they're outdoors and when they're indoors, reading your cartoons and helping to preserve and protect the wildlife?
Oh, yes, I've been interested in that for a long time. At one time, I thought grading cartoons was a silly way to make a living, and so I went back to graduate school, and I was going to be an ecologist and be a history professor. And I wasn't able to continue with that, so as an amateur, I've always been interested in nature and wildlife. And yes, my cartoons about entertaining people with wildlife cartoons. You know, I've given a lot of copies of the books to people I know are interested in nature, and they just think it's wonderful. My gosh, finally, here's an entertainment feature that's for us, if they're special interest.
Since Meriwether Lewis is one of my ancestors, I've always been interested in hearing the family stories about his expedition. I always enjoy learning and reading more about this major expedition. What did you find most unusual in your research about what occurred as they traveled? How many people were there? How many different areas did they cover? How many different Indian groups did they encounter? How was the report handled back in Washington, D.C. when they were able to tell the leaders of the United States what was out there? The
final expedition that went from North Dakota was about 30 or maybe 33 people. Before that, they had around 45. So it was a pretty small number of people if they had if Indians had attacked them, they had good weapons. They could defend themselves, but they would have been in trouble. So they had to be diplomats. Yeah, I thought it was fascinating to read about the Indians that had never met white men before. They'd heard about them, but they hadn't met them. And so it was quite a challenge for Lewis and Clark to meet those people and to talk with them because they didn't know the language. So I think they relied mostly on sign language, and I'd really like to know more about that. How did the Indians across the entire continent develop a sign language that they could all understand? They had one or two people with the expedition who knew sign language. They relied on that a lot. His description of various Indian chiefs was very complimentary. They were intelligent men, and they did so much to help the expedition. And I guess if they know what was going to happen, maybe they wouldn't. I remember I attended a powwow in North Dakota, and they had Indian nations from all over North America. And they made a grand entry, and they marched around with the drums playing and singing. And after that was over, the announcer said, if we had this much unity when Columbus arrived, we would still own this country. I guess he was right. The Indian nations, unfortunately, they fought each other, and they couldn't get a united plan to keep their own land.
Most of the Indian nations in the plains areas were hunters and gatherers until they were put on reservations and forced to become farmers. They managed to live successfully off the land. So I've always been curious why the expedition almost starved to death, why they couldn't live off the land.
The point where they almost starved to death, they were, hunting, mostly hunting all the way, and they lived on bison until they got to they crossed the Continental Divide, and there were no bison on the other side of the Continental Divide. And there were very few other animals they could hunt. And they got up on the ridge of the mountains at a time where there were very few animals to hunt, and it was winter. And they didn't have winter clothes, and they didn't have a stock of food with them, and they didn't know where to go. I mean, they had a guide that showed them the trail, and then he left. And that was why they were trying to find their way, following a trail. We think of a trail, where someone maintains it and builds things. A tree falls down, they cut it out. The Indians never cut the trees on the Lolo Trail. If a tree fell down, they stepped their horses over it, or if it's too big, they walked around it. And so it became a braided trail along a ridge, and sometimes dipping down and coming back up to the ridge. And they were trying to follow something that was very indistinct with snow falling. And they finally got to a spot where they camped out. They found some water, and they were so hungry they killed a colt, and they ate the colt of the horse, and they sent Clark ahead as fast as he could to try and find help. And he was lucky. He managed to get out of the mountains and find the Nez Perce Indians, and then the Nez Perce rescued them. They came stumbling down out of formation one at a time, barely alive, and the Nez Perce said, maybe they're dangerous, maybe we ought to kill them. And they had a meeting, and there was a woman at the meeting who said she had once traveled and met a white man who was nice to her, said, let's wait and see. And that saved the expedition. And Nez Perce gave them fish, and they gave them other food and brought them back to health.
Definitely stories along the way, and they recorded in their journals what they were seeing, where they went. How was the report accepted when it was presented back in Washington, D.C.?
When they were coming back down the Missouri River, people thought they were dead. And they've met trappers and traders coming up the river. Like the United States was going ahead and exploring the territory without any report from Lewis and Clark. Of course, it led to the United States claiming all that territory. And they didn't print anything about it for a long time. So the general public, there'd be no way for them to read the journal and use it as a guide for where they were going.
Were they collecting different specimens of plants and animals and returning those to the Smithsonian or the Natural History Museums?
Yes, Lewis particularly collected a lot of things. He collected plants, and then they collected specimens of animals. They even sent a few live animals back on a boat from North Dakota. I don't know how much of the collections that Lewis made survived, because when they got out in Montana near the Mars River and the Missouri River, they made a cache and they buried a lot of things, and they were going to pick them up and bring them back on the way back. But when they came back and they unburied the stuff, they found everything that was organic or paper had just rotted away. It was useless, and the only thing they could rescue was metal items, like they had some gunpowder in some lead canisters.
You describe some cliffs that they saw, and the cliffs have shapes. They weren't carved, but they were just natural. What were they?
That's the scenic wonder of the canoe trip in Missouri. I'd start in a canoe or a raft from Fort Benton. You don't want to take a motorboat. You go too fast, and the current just carries you down. And you go through an area where there's white sandstone, and then there are volcanic lava walls, and the erosion has made these so interesting and so unique that Lewis spent a lot of time writing in his journal just about the scenic beauty. He just described it in words after words. And Clark was kind of he'd just say we made 30 miles a day. But then Clark was pulling the boats, and Lewis was walking with his dog, looking at the scenery in that stretch. And that's what makes it such a great attraction for recreational trips. People can float down that river and camp on the same places where Lewis and Clark camped, and you see a unique scenery. I mean, it's not like Yellowstone. It's not like the Grand Canyon. It's like the white rocks of the Missouri River.
Since your characters are animals in the present day representing members of the Lewis and Clark expedition, you were able to incorporate a little bit of current issues as well, so that when they arrived in the Pacific Ocean forest, they encountered an owl that was quite famous among environmentalists to try and not have the forest cut.
Yes, the spotted owl and Chief Commonwealth reincarnated as a spotted owl. Sometimes people say, well, how important is one owl? Well, it's not the owl, it's the whole woods. We need more forest everywhere, and unfortunately they've been able to save a lot of the forest in the Northwest. I hope they can continue to do it. I think they're shifting the environmental message more. It's not just this animal or that animal, which is rare. It's an entire community of life. It's very important to keep, not only just for recreation so people can look at it, but the forests are producing some oxygen, and they're not producing the CO2. And we're going to need more oxygen and less of the carbon dioxide in order to keep the planet from overheating.
Are there animals that you would like to present in future cartoons that aren't getting the attention that they ought to?
Yeah, I've drawn quite a few animals in the Wally Woods comic strip. I have a story that involves a squirrel, and I've got the squirrels and various birds. I don't know birds as much. I guess it's because a bird has a fixed expression on his face, and it doesn't really work to change that. But the mammals, you can kind of work with their face and make them more human.
What about the coyotes?
Yeah, coyotes are good.
These are animals that have adapted both in the wild and in the cities.
That's true. They're pretty common animals. Everybody knows what they look like now.
Even though your book is out of print, it is available in the museum and in other places.
Yeah, there's a copy at the Cartoon Library in Columbus, Ohio. I gave away a lot of copies and sold a few copies, and it shows up on used book sites.
You're creator of Wally's Woods comic strip. Who's Wally?
I didn't model him after anybody. I just kind of drew a cartoon character, and I thought I wanted the character to be someone who's retired and lived in a cabin near a park. And that meant that almost all the adventures would be this one guy and his dog walking in the park and seeing animals and having adventures. And then I added other characters like a park ranger and friends that come by.
And that is on the internet?
Well, it's not now. Again, there are some books. I published several books with the Wally's Woods comic strips. And again, they're out of print, but they show up on used book sites. It did appear in a newspaper for a short time. Also, it was on the internet for a couple of years when American Greetings had an internet site. Lately, I've been just putting the cartoons in a local shopping newspaper. They print them up, and I don't know if it'll ever be printed again, maybe as a comic book, because the newspapers now print comic strips so small that the way I've drawn them, they wouldn't work. I'd have to draw them over again, because now people draw comic strips. In order to get the words in, they have to have very small picture, maybe just a face talking, and then have a few words.
I certainly look forward to reading and seeing more of your cartoons. Thank you for being my guest.
Oh, well, thanks. I enjoyed talking about it.
I have been speaking with Dean Norman, a cartoonist who is creator of Wally's Woods comic strip. I'm Nancy Pearlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Pearlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.